Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week, predictions of IQ from being a toddler. The warning from the CDC as leprosy cases continue to spread, notably in Florida. Florida itself has other issues right now as it's currently trying to deal with malaria as the number of cases increases. India is backpedaling on its previous decision to primarily focus on organic farming and instead embracing genetic modification. A Nobel laureate from the Johns Hopkins has had even more articles retracted, leading to a current 6 over 2 years. Fruit flies have been genetically modified to give birth without ever having to have sex, effectively creating Jesus fruit flies. Finally, electrified cement as a novel way of storing energy as effectively giant batteries if it ever gets off the ground. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the prediction of your intelligence. The research claims that analyzing your behavior as a toddler may be able to figure out what you're going to be like 16 years later as you turn 18. This is a very bold claim. And it will likely not translate to everywhere and every way in the world. For example, American students, no matter how intelligent they may be as a toddler, might not ever really get to the point where they can be considered to have an IQ. This is one reason why we are somewhat skeptical of the research, as it is based on research conducted in the United States of America and Germany. The research is building on prior studies, something called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, but the actual findings themselves are specific to these countries for now. What they were doing was analysing brainwaves of the toddlers and then figuring out what these were, and applying them to tests conducted much later in life. The study should be taken with a degree of skepticism, as there are a couple of issues with it. The first and perhaps most significant is that it was a relatively small study at 202 18-year-olds. These were the same 18-year-olds who had previously been involved in the last study. So we at least have longitudinal data, albeit a very small amount of longitudinal data. The other issue, let's say, is that they've tried to formalize interventions relating to supporting the children's development, and that's somewhat more difficult as you will have variation between children. The final issue is, well, the basis on which they're building this research, and let's be clear about it, the basis is sound. That being that the brain undergoes certain stages of activity. Fast activity for when you are actually trying to process and use your brain, a slow activity when the brain is trying to prune and deal with neurons that are considered, let's say, unnecessary. The more of this pruning and, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, management and organization of your brain there is, the more intelligent you will theoretically be. The researchers, both themselves and in the past, have found that the more stimulated and neurologically activated the children are, that is, the more they have to think, the more of this stimulation occurs at the right times, and the more of the low activity for pruning of the brain is activated at the right times, and that's what leads to their conclusion. The other key takeaway, for lack of a better way of phrasing this, is that many of the children involved in this study were institutionalized, that is, they were in an orphanage, or at least the nice way of saying being in an orphanage. Of these, approximately a third were never in an orphanage, or otherwise never institutionalized. This leads to the results as we're describing them. The interesting difference, and to a certain extent argument, that by stimulating the brains of children, you can mitigate the effects of being institutionalized, which, according to other research, does have a negative effect on the individual's welfare, at least insofar as their intelligence is concerned. If you are, let's say, developmentally retarded, whether that is because of retardation or however you wish to call it now, or if you've simply not been given the opportunities to develop, you may wish to consider applying for the Washington Post as an occupation. That is because they've yet again fallen for acupuncture. For some ridiculous and, frankly, inexplicable reason, they have published articles effectively illustrating, or at least claiming to illustrate, that acupuncture does more than it does, which, to be clear about it, is purely theatre and placebo, not treatment. We'll preface the evisceration of this article with clear-cut referrals. That is, go look at the Cochrane Group's reviews of acupuncture. Just about anything it is claimed to have benefits for can never be substantiated, or at best, it can only be substantiated in China, which raises issues as to the inferability of this as an evidence-based treatment outside of that country. Now, for the actual article itself, the author, let's call them, who amazingly does have an MD degree, claims that meta-analyses of 39 quality randomized trials found that it was better. 39 out of thousands and thousands of such, let's say, analyses and clinical trials. Again, considering that this is purely theatre and placebo. In fact, science-based medicine has one of the most explicit criticisms of the article itself and the research it refers to. That is, it is selective in what it refers to. Specifically, outdated meta-reviews, outdated and certainly not comprehensive meta-reviews, and importantly, reviews that don't encapsulate the totality of the evidence available that should have been. The author even failed to take stock of one of the conclusory statements in the meta-review. That is, variations in the effect size of acupuncture in different trials are driven predominantly by differences in treatments received by the control group, rather than by differences in the characteristics of the acupuncture group. Yeah, that's an important quote, largely owing to the fact that if it's the control group variation, you're not actually seeing the effect of the treatment. You're seeing some weird placebo effect showing up. Given that this is meant to be somebody qualified as a doctor, they're not basing their conclusions on evidence, and it's one of the better and more recent examples of why the Washington Post really isn't suitable as anything more than toilet paper, and unpleasant toilet paper at that. This is not the only medical news this week that is concerning. In Florida, we have the spread of leprosy. Now, for most people, leprosy is perhaps better known for losing things like your nose, parts of your limbs, and similar. But that's not all there is to it. For most developed countries, leprosy is well under control or doesn't exist at all on any appreciable scale. This doesn't mean it doesn't exist across the world. In fact, there's still 120 countries that are reporting it, and at least 200,000 more cases each year. Leprosy itself is a bacterial disease which, in short, damages your skin and nervous system. And because it's quite obvious when you have it and it is bacterial, there's a good chance you'll notice it when things start falling off or you have growths you don't want. This is why the 15 cases in Florida just this year alone are a worry. Although that's 15 cases in Florida specifically, there were nearly 160 across the USA in total, and that's just for 2020. 2023 is considerably more worrying, but Florida is the front runner. They have the highest instance of it so far. This is not to say that there's been any travel limitations or necessarily official warnings issued, at least with relationship to Florida itself and leprosy. Rather, you should avoid taking random food and drink from strangers. Well, that's good life advice anyway, let alone specifically with Florida and leprosy. Next, we have a study that has been misconstrued and certainly miscommunicated throughout most of the world so far, and it regards COVID-19 and transmission of vaccines itself, or at least the COVID-19 from vaccines. First, you cannot give someone COVID-19 from the vaccine. The vaccine is like a scrambled egg that has been cooked. You cannot then reassemble the egg with shell from the scrambled egg. It simply doesn't work that way. You can't reverse it. What you can do is make a small portion of the virus from this, specifically the spike protein. This spike protein then allows for the body to recognize it and certain antigen sites on it specifically, develop the immune cells needed, and then develop immunity from this. This is where the article gets misunderstood and, to a certain extent, miscommunicated, and arguably, with some people, deliberately misconstrued. The article notes that there is a small amount of antibodies, these being the things your immune system makes to deal with the virus initially and tag it for the rest of the immune cells to attack, that get aerosolized from the individuals who have been vaccinated. Understand, your body will make antibodies for lots of things. Anything it encounters and views as an antigen that's pathogenic will get antibodies made against it. You don't need the vaccine for this. If you were infected with COVID-19, you would get the same antibodies being generated. The problem with this article, or at least the problem with the way it's been misconstrued, is that for some reason, people are reading this different ways, but the most egregious are that you can infect others by being vaccinated, which, as established, is nonsense, or worse yet, that somehow or other you are shedding parts of the virus, which again is nonsense because you cannot shed parts of the virus this way. It is physically, genetically, and functionally impossible. It's also not what the research found, which is the important caveat there. It is clear that some antibodies can be aerosolized, and these, at least in theory, could contribute to herd immunity, which is another element to this that doesn't really get touched on. That is, the researchers state that aerosolizing antibodies from those who have been vaccinated could help, to a very limited extent, mitigate some of the airborne virus particles because they tag it in the air, and the recipient of that, whether it is the person who has been vaccinated and made the antibodies, or someone else who could theoretically then be infected, see the antibody on the virus particle and begin attacking it much sooner. As the authors write, it is tempting to speculate that aerosol-mediated antibody transfer may have possibly contributed to their findings. Going back to Florida now, and this time for a disease that you should be worried about, the increase in malaria, and the stupidity of people spouting conspiracy theories that Bill Gates is somehow responsible for its spread. Malaria has been in Florida for a while. There are a number of diseases that have been in Florida for a while now, and the issue with it is that it's spread by mosquitoes for the most part. The mosquitoes begin their life in stagnant water, something Florida has a lot of in the Everglades. The mosquitoes come out of this as, well, flying pests, suck on someone's blood, and that someone happens to have malaria. They then share it with another individual when they go to suck their blood as well. They then go off, have mosquito sex, lay the eggs in the stagnant water, and the cycle repeats. This has nothing to do with Bill Gates, but it is something of a concern, largely because there have been a slight increase in the number of infections in Florida, and to a lesser extent Texas, in recent months. Understand, the increase in recent months is partly down to the fact that people are stupid, noting a unusual increase and then attributing it to something other than what it is, and because, well, life happens. Why they haven't made such a fuss any other times in the last 20 years that malaria has been present in Florida is surprising. The impact of this is relatively benign, at least in terms of Florida. They can get access to the medication required to deal with malaria, and it's unlikely to cause death. Whereas in other parts of the world, where it especially affects the very young and the very old, there is a much higher toll, largely because of the effect it has on blood circulation delivery of oxygen due to the destruction of red blood cells. The very young and the very old simply can't compensate for the loss, and so they begin to experience side effects of being infected, and ultimately possibly death. The reason the conspiracy theory nutters have come out is due to programs to try and deal with the spread. Notably, programs that are focusing on genetically modifying mosquitoes to sterilize them, thereby preventing at least part of that cycle, that being the reproductive cycle. If there aren't more mosquitoes to continue spreading malaria between individuals who have been infected and those who are not infected, you don't get it spread, and eventually it gets eradicated. Exactly the same fundamental idea as behind vaccines and herd immunity. Just in this case, you're targeting the vector rather than the disease itself. Even if you were to theoretically assume that that was the cause, the problem you face is that the species of mosquito that was genetically modified is not the same one released recently. The recent release is a species of mosquito that will spread things like Zika and dengue fever, but not malaria. That's a key here. There are different kinds of mosquitoes that carry different kinds of disease. The partially funded by the Bill Gates Foundation did not release a species of mosquito related to malaria. Yeah. There are, of course, other issues with this, and the article linked below will provide a lot more details about why this conspiracy theory is not just stupid, but fundamentally wrong. Next we have other health news, and rather than just being disappointed and frustrated, you're likely to be angry, and that's because of vegans. Well, not just because they're a vegan, that makes most people angry. Rather that a vegan mother from Florida will be getting life in prison after killing their 18-month-old child. The 18-month-old child weighed roughly 9 kilograms. Yeah, nowhere near enough. But not just that, but her husband and 2 other children were also malnourished. This is why a vegan diet is not suitable for children. Arguably, a vegan diet's not suitable for humans, but at least consider the fact that children need things like lipids or fats in their diet to be able to develop. They need lots of protein, lots of carbohydrates, and more, all so they can do what they need to do, which is grow and hopefully be happy. Frustratingly, this was not a scenario in which only the mother was to blame, or the father. Rather, both parents were effectively forcing on their children a raw fruit and vegetable diet, although, thankfully, to some degree, the toddler was also provided with breast milk, so they had some more lipids and some more protein in their diet than the other children had. But nonetheless, it's a small improvement over what is, frankly, a shit scenario. This is also yet another reason why vegans should be hated. Skipping from dietary news that's frustrating and angering, to Indian news that's somewhat more positive and hopeful. India looks to be rolling back its decision to rely more on organic farming and instead increasingly embracing genetic modification. Something that isn't really a change in practice for farmers so much as it is a bureaucratic change. Many farmers in India have already been using genetically modified seeds for quite a while. Illegally so, but nonetheless they've been using them. The Indian government is choosing to start approving applications for gene-edited plants. These are things like BT cotton or eggplants. The reason for these is that they don't require the same use of pesticides, to a certain extent can compensate for the use of herbicides, and aren't affected by certain pests due to the genetic modification lets them produce a fairly targeted, narrow, and specific pesticide in themselves that means that you get more crop from a same-sized area. Effectively better yields for less money. The report that provided the fundamental basis for this changing government position has an important quote that applies to the rest of the world as much as it does India. While the practice of organic farming can be popularized in niche spheres where premium export prices are available, this cannot be a generalized policy for the state. It might lock the state's agriculture into a low-yield, low-income cycle, leading to more unscientific and irrational uses of land in the long term. For those who are at least somewhat familiar with what organic is, means, and the processes underlying it, this is not a surprise. However, it is for most people a rude wake-up call. Next we have news that's attached to research and medicine to some degree. It's in relationship to a, illegally run research lab of a kind. California is well known for being liberal, but one thing they're not liberal about is the running of, black market laboratories. In this case, one that was supposed to eventually lead into a medical laboratory for diagnostic testing. It was not there yet, it had not been approved, and there was no real plan. Yet, recently it was raided and, amongst other issues, they found hundreds, verging on to 1,000 research rodents, a large number of vats of materials, at least 20 different pathogens. This ranged from HIV to COVID-19 and more. There was also a number of staff involved, and it was all operating without anybody having caught on until recently. You may not be aware, but it is incredibly difficult to get a small biotech startup running. A lot of the issues with this come down to regulatory hurdles. Just making a lab in your shed isn't really an option, but you can do it if you have the appropriate permits, you have the appropriate allowances, you get all the necessary hurdles met. But then you need to buy the equipment, buy the reagents, and if you were wanting to do what they have, which is use genetically modified mice, you need to have the appropriate records to show that you are actually able to receive them. Most companies will not export research-specific genetically modified rodents to just any old location. This makes what happened in this facility a very big worry. Funnily enough, the only reason it was even discovered is that somebody noticed that there was a garden hose attached to a building that was meant to be vacant. Yeah, a code enforcement officer found a random hose attached to a building that should have been vacant, and nobody had found out about this before now. That's a big oversight issue. The really frustrating part, at least from a research perspective, is the ethics behind the animals that were there. Largely that the animals that they did have, the hundreds and hundreds of white mice, were being kept in abysmal conditions, and hundreds of them were dead, even when they did the raid itself, and who knows how long that had been the case. There are, at least in terms of research scenarios, minimum standards for research animals, and this black market laboratory was able to eschew all of those standards simply because it was not kept in regulation. And this is at least one argument in favor, very vague terms, of the regulated research animal environment. It's not as though your average individual can just go all Walter White and start making their own laboratory. A lot of the time it's much harder than you see on TV. This is not to say research is perfect, by no means. There are going to be your outliers in anything and everything. For example, this week's Nobel laureate from Hopkins, who has now had more research articles retracted. Understand, a Nobel Prize is pretty much the peak of scientific research. There are some similar prizes for mathematics and physics, although mathematics more so than physics. But for most research, for example, like Dr. Greg Semenz's, the Nobel Prize is it. Yet 6 articles in 2 years. It's not a record-breaking level of retraction, although when you add the 10 corrections that have been added, it is getting sort of up there, but it's not as bad as it could be for a lot of other individuals. For example, just in the recent weeks, we noticed that certain presidents have had to step down due to conduct that led to effectively the same result. The upside to this week's news is that the articles appear to have all been retracted pretty much voluntarily after the images were scrutinized and concerns about their integrity were raised. There is also a 7th paper we should mention, but it appears, based on the public statements around that 7th paper was entirely down to another author's, integrity issues, and that they have taken full responsibility for it, leaving only 6, plus the 10 corrections, on this particular individual's reputation, and certainly as a dark mark on that reputation. There are further details in the Baltimore Sun's article going through the concerns raised and the issues with further publications, where the concerns were raised, how, and what's being done about it, and you can find the link to that in the description box below. Going to animal news, we have a blind fish. Yet blind fish that can somehow see light, which doesn't sound like blindness. There are very simple eyeballs out there, or at least something similar to an eyeball, that allows some of the most fundamental organisms on Earth to respond to the stimuli of light, whether that is to hide or move towards it. This is where the cavefish and research at the University of College London raises some interesting questions about what could and could not be considered an eye. Certainly a far less thorny question than whether or not Finding Nemo should have ended differently. This research has found effectively the same sort of phenomena in the form of cavefish as we do with those very fundamental and rudimentary organisms. That is, when they took tissue samples, cultured them, and basically created a cell culture, they were able to expose them to light or dark, and the cells appeared to have the ability to not only detect this change, but to adopt a cycle to the light and dark changes in the laboratory setting. This was not just a one-off or isolated scenario either. There are a few important caveats to the research. The first is that the fish themselves have varying degrees of the loss of their eyes. That's an adaptation to being in an environment where an eye would do nothing for you. The adaptation in multiple different caves from different time frames ranges from between 10,000 and 10 million years ago, but they are all the same species and can all interbreed. This then means you have not only a different degree of evolutionary adaptation across those caves, but the same response at a molecular and genetic level. In other weird news, we have Peruvian scientists creating fruit flies that can give virgin birth. We should start creating a church. Well, arguably you could say the fruit flies are the Jesus of science, given how commonly they're used and killed, and, well, no, they're not often revived. Nonetheless, they are a common research specimen used. Genetically modifying them so that the female fruit fly can give birth without ever having to have a male fruit fly involved is interesting. It's also noted that the trait, let's say, it can be passed down generation on generation. This is not a phenomena that is unique, and there are many species on Earth that can already do so. For example, snakes, crocodiles, lizards, even certain birds and similar can all undergo what is called parthenogenesis. The effects of this can have varying negative traits, but on other hand, they can also be very useful if there is a sudden decrease in the size of the population or other issues with, well, finding a mate. The research was fundamentally based on the ability to find a similar species that was able to reproduce asexually, and then match the genes inside the fruit fly to do the same. It did, however, take 6 years and more than 220,000 fruit flies to achieve. Not sure you can call this a flying success. In the last animal news we have for you this week, and certainly the last news for this animal, it is the discovery of what is arguably the biggest animal to have ever lived, at least on Earth. The remains are called Parasitus colossus, and it was found in the Peruvian desert. The animal appeared to have lived about 30 million years ago and, well, was frankly quite startling. It is theorized to be weighing somewhere between 85 and 340 tons. Your average small suburban car is somewhere around 4 tons at the high end. That means at the smallest, this thing is 25 times the weight of a car. At the high end, we're getting closer to somewhere around 85 times the size of a small car. A blue whale, and the biggest we've known at least, is 199 tons, which is roughly in the middle of the range given. The weird thing here is that the animal itself is closer to a whale than it is anything else, which would indicate that at some point, for some reason, the Peruvian desert was covered in enough water that a giant whale-like creature existed within it. In other news that could be useful, at least in keeping our environment as it is now, somewhat more predictable, we have the use of cement and turning it into what could practically be described as giant stationary batteries that are otherwise inert. Most batteries that we have now rely on the use of some sort of electrodes, some sort of solute-rich liquid to act as a media through which current travels, and the ability to, control current going in and coming out. Cement doesn't have any of these things at this stage. That's where modifying cement by, taking cement, water, and a material called carbon black, which is just charcoal, simply put, and this allowed them to turn it into a battery for most intents and purposes. The important thing here is that these giant cement batteries aren't really giant batteries. They're more like supercapacitors, and this will make them a little more difficult to handle, largely because the way a capacitor behaves and the way a battery behaves are night and day in some respects. Both of them will build up and store power. A capacitor, however, in this case a supercapacitor, releases its stored energy very quickly. A battery is much slower and arguably more controlled. There's also the big issue with this, that the ability to store power within them is, extremely limited. They can only really achieve about as much as powering LED lights for now, which isn't a great deal. That of course doesn't mean that it's a useless prospect. The key to this is, rather than being able to store a lot of power in a small space, which is effectively the ambition of most battery technology at the moment, you can instead make a very large power storage facility very cheaply. That's largely because the carbon and cement used in this, along with water, are all fairly cheap by comparison to things like lithium. The example is also a very small model, so the next stage is to try and target something the size of a car battery, although this would be very heavy and unwieldy, and then ultimately, if that proves at least somewhat more successful with the addition of extra material like potassium chloride, they can scale it up to something like, say, a house, release the foundations for a house. This would, according to their estimates, be enough to keep the house running for an entire day, based on renewables. The final news item we have for you this week is something of a disappointment in some respects, and it's all about superconductors. Superconductors are, as the name suggests, able to conduct electricity extremely well. The problem is, the week past has seen a lot of news about South Korean claims to have created a room temperature superconductor. This would be a sort of holy grail, if you will. The issue is that it may not be true. The reason a room temperature superconductor is so ambitious is that most of the ones used to date have had to be run extremely hot or extremely cold, generally looking at extremely cold if possible. This, of course, requires the use of a lot of energy that is effectively wasted. And obviously, if you generate waste, it's not going to be efficient, and without efficiency, you won't see commercial utilization of the development. The reason this has gained a certain amount of attention is that it's made from both readily available materials and comparably cheap materials to purchase. Effectively just copper, lead, and apatite. It also works up to 127 degrees Celsius, 261 freedom units. This means that you get a very effective development for relatively little and without the need for particularly special materials on a large scale. It also appears to be based on some at least plausible bases. The challenge will be that it's a South Korean superconductor and, in recent years they've had a bit of a bad track record with faking these. The good news is that the research itself is relatively readily accessible, and you'll find links to it in the description box below. This means that anybody and everybody who has both the means, resources, personnel, and will to do so can, for the most part, replicate what's been described, which is useful in that we'll now have, hopefully, lots of replication of this research to prove whether or not it's fake, that it's flawed, that it's both of these, that it's real but flawed, or, in the most optimistic of scenarios, that this is a huge breakthrough and it's a real phenomena. It is worth noting that you would have to be an idiot to have deliberately committed fraud and then tried to publish 2 articles on this and effectively have caught most of the world's attention that has at least some interest in this or is tangentially drawn in, or you'd have to be very optimistic about your findings. If neither of these is true, then it is entirely possible, although very unlikely at this stage, that they mean no malfeasance, but they're somehow ignorant of what's gone wrong, which would not be the first time to happen in history. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.